Corey Lewandowski, right, President Trump's first campaign manager, is an author of Let Trump Be Trump. Doug Mills, The New York Times. President Trump likes gold fixtures, marble tiles, and the trappings of grandeur. When he talks about himself in interviews and in his books, he talks in superlatives. He has billed himself as masterful negotiator. He has described himself as having the world's best memory. He almost never apologizes, and he rarely admits to having flaws. Over the years, his advisors and aides have worked to maintain the image Mr. Trump has spent a lifetime cultivating, a particular challenge during a presidential race, when candidates' flaws are exposed. But few candidates try to keep such an iron grip on their image as Mr. Trump did in 2016, driving his aides to do battle with reporters over seemingly minor details. So it is striking that Let Trump Be Trump, a new book by two former campaign aides, paints a portrait of Mr. Trump that shows him as he is, at least partly, as opposed to how he would like to be seen. The book is by Corey Lewandowski, Mr. Trump's first campaign manager, and David Bossie, the head of the group Citizens United and the deputy campaign manager during the final months of the 2016 presidential race. It is a combination of over-the-top praise for their candidate, nostalgic remembrances of glory days, and rewarding aides they liked, and score-settling with their enemies, particularly Paul Manafort, whose arrival in the campaign started the countdown clock on Mr. Lewandowski's dismissal. In other words, a fairly typical campaign memoir, albeit with some new ways of praising the winner. Like Midas, he's turned everything he's touched into gold, they wrote of Mr. Trump. But the authors are also the first Trump aides to put their names to stories about the campaign's internal dynamics and to describe some notorious habits of Mr. Trump's, like his preferences for lunch. He really did eat a lunch of 2 Big Macs, 2 filet-o-fish sandwiches, and a chocolate shake, which he would call a malted. Do you think I deserve a malted today? I think I deserve one, Mr. Trump would say after a hard-charging day of appearances. He flipped incessantly through cable news, monitoring his coverage. The snacks aboard his private plane included Oreos and chips. He ordered people who sneezed to sit away from him. He ordered people Diet Cokes regardless of whether they actually wanted them, because that is what he drinks. He spoke in non-sequiturs that did not always make sense to the people on the other end of the conversation. Corey sat there with a half-smile on his face, not knowing quite how to respond. The authors wrote about Mr. Lewandowski's first job interview with Mr. Trump. As the candidate ticked off his fleet of planes and helicopters, Corey would come to find in the months and years that followed that Donald Trump's mind works differently than most, they wrote. His thoughts sometimes come out like pieces of a puzzle. It's only later when you put the pieces together that you realize how much they're worth. Early on, according to the authors, who stitched together their own experiences and glossed over the times when neither was on the campaign, Mr. Trump got key validation from his wife, Melania, for an attack on Senator John McCain, whom he suggested was a war hero simply for being captured, because Mr. Trump said he had not helped veterans enough. And he could be brutal to his underlings. The mode that he switches to when things aren't going his way can feel like an all-out assault. Mr. Lewandowski and Mr. Bossie wrote about Mr. Trump's notorious outbursts. Those moments pass quickly, they wrote, but can be disorienting. Being the target of his wrath can make for a pretty jarring experience. When Reince Priebus, then the chairman of the Republican National Committee, told Mr. Trump the same weekend the Access Hollywood tape was made public by the Washington Post that he needed to consider dropping out of the race, Mr. Trump replied, "If the Republican Party is going to run away from me, then I will take you all down with me." 2 longer-serving aides with whom Mr. Lewandowski feuded, Roger J. Stone Jr. and Sam Nunberg, are marginalized. While many have given Mr. Stone, Mr. Trump's longest-serving advisor, the credit for bringing women who had accused Bill Clinton of UAL misconduct to the second debate, a stunt that clearly rattled Hillary Clinton, the authors attributed the idea to Stephen K. Bannon, who was by then the campaign chief executive. Other former colleagues came in for warmer treatment, particularly Mr. Bannon, who is described as helping correct the ship that Mr. Manafort had driven toward trouble. Kellyanne Conway was shown repeatedly trying to make Mr. Trump understand how his words could be offensive to women, particularly talking about the weight of Alicia Machado, the Miss Universe pageant entrant who became a flashpoint at the end of the campaign. Then there are aspects of Mr. Trump that will wholly unfamiliar to most people who have worked with him. In one passage, the authors wrote that Mr. Trump, whose advisors always privately say he does not read books, loves Memory, Dreams, Reflections, by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst. And then there are things that Mr. Trump said that he has tried to paper over with the passage of time. The author said that as part of his preparation, for example, he learned what he needed to know from the questions he was asked in interviews with news outlets. And when he hired Mr. Lewandowski, who was recommended to him at the beginning of the campaign, Mr. Trump described his chances of winning as 10%. In another passage, right after winning, the authors described Mr. Trump marveling that he got into the race essentially to have some fun. Neither anecdote is consistent with Mr. Trump's insistence that he always knew he was going to win. But the authors observed that the former casino owner makes his own rules, and plays by them. The house always wins, they wrote. A version of this article appears in print on December 12, 2017, on page A17 of the New York edition with the headline showing Trump, at least partly, as he is.